Good morning, everybody. May I ask you to sit down? A very warm welcome at this session, which is organized by Parliamentarians for Global Action and the Human Dignity Fund. My name is Boris Dietrich. I'm a senator in the Dutch Parliament, and it's my honor to moderate this session. And we have a few objectives with this session. I would like to read them out so you know more or less what to expect. We would love to share best practices and lessons learned about successful legislative reforms at the national level. We would like to identify opportunities and challenges for legislative reform and explore strategies to overcome obstacles and encourage parliamentarians to take action. We like to foster collaboration amongst parliamentarians that can build a supportive network to advance LGBTI+, affirming reforms and decriminalization. And lastly, we like to encourage dialogue and effective collaboration between parliamentarians and LGBTI+ civil society organizations. Now, we have a few messages through the video. I think it would be best to start with them, and then we have distinguished guests here behind the table. But let us start with two statements, pre-recorded messages, and the first one is from Valerie Woods. She is the Speaker of the House of Representatives in Belize, in the Belize Parliament. Let's have a look at what Valerie is going to tell us. Valerie.
Valérie.
I hope somebody is pressing the right button.
Espero que tengamos un técnico que nos pueda ayudar y que le dé el botón que tiene que darle.
And I've heard her message already, and it's really worthwhile waiting. She's talking about Belize and legislation in Parliament. And she's speaking in English, so you don't need your translation device. Now I don't know what to say anymore. Tell us this joke. Oh, this is really awful.
Whilst we're waiting for she starts, I'm Christmas Untitled Chapter, Global LGBTI.
Intervention dans la salle sans microphone.
Maybe you could stand up and speak up a little so everybody can hear you. Yes.
I was on a delegation that went to the Vatican.
Lamentablemente,
Went to see the Pope. We didn't get an audience from the Pope. But the appointment statement is on the back of the Pope's relationship as Bishop of Buenos Aires, Archbishop of Buenos Aires, with a leading lawyer in Argentina. That they had then, there was a case inside the background to the presentation we're about to get, where under the Constitution, the law in Belize was challenged. And there's so much more progress There's so much more progress often through using constitutional law rather than trying to get parliamentarians to change the law, which presents its own political challenges. Anyway, a junior court struck down the criminalization. The churches largely appealed against it, and the relationship between the Pope and his Argentinian lawyer friend in fact then got the Catholic Church, they withdrew from the legal action appealing against the junior court in the Supreme Court. And that then struck down the effectively criminalization in Belize. Now that obviously
maybe that will come up in Valerie's statement. Thank you so much for this introduction. And maybe later on we can discuss it. But we also have two guests behind the table, so I propose that we will start with Naveed. Naveed Qamar is Member of Parliament in Pakistan. And I would like to ask you, because we read about Pakistan, and especially transgender rights is something that in Pakistan, in Parliament, has been discussed. But let's say the rights of lesbians, gays, bisexuals, not so much. So maybe you can inform us about this legislative process in Pakistan.
Thank you very much, Boris, and fellow parliamentarians and participants of this very large rainbow group that is gathered here in Copenhagen. Yes, I think at least as far as this one aspect of the LGBT rights, which is the transgender rights, we bring some good news from one of the most difficult parts of the world, which is Pakistan. Generally, conservative society, it's an Islamic republic with very strong religious overtones in it, even in the constitution, and yet we were able to push through, and it's not being discussed, it's been passed by Parliament. It is law today, which basically talks about non-discrimination of any kind whatsoever against people who are transgender. Now, transgender people are not something that is new to the society of Pakistan. They have existed in our society in India, or generally even in the Middle East, for centuries. It was only in the more recent times, in the colonial and post-colonial era, that these became ostracized people, or people that had to be either discriminated against or not be given the same kind of rights or equals as any other citizen or human being would be there. And therefore there was this need to come up with a law which would protect these people. Otherwise, one thinks that under the Constitution all citizens are equal, and therefore there is no need for any special protection for any person. And yet, because of being marginalized within the society, this law was drafted, and it was passed first in the Senate, then it came to the National Assembly, where I had to pilot it through. Just some of the few things that are covered in this. First of all, the right to choose your gender. That right has been given to anybody who is transgender, or I believe even now other kinds of people are included in this. So you can be either male or female, depending on what your preference is, rather than to be determined through any kind of either a medical procedure or anybody else determining it for you, or your parents determining it for you. Then you have the right, by your choice, then to get the national identity card, which is the base for every other kind of identities. So, and you can do it either as a male or female. So you get your passport, your driver's license, your right to vote, your right to get into an educational institution, and so on, as per your own choice. Then after ensuring that you are able to get this choice, then that choice is protected throughout the entire spectrum of what a day-to-day person would be going through. So a transgender person cannot be discriminated against in terms of getting into an educational institution, in terms of getting employment, or for getting housing, or any other kind of issue which normally one would expect not to be something that you have to work on, and all of these things under the law have become criminalized. So if you discriminate against a transgender person, then it is a criminal offense. In fact, so this is the reverse of what some of the things that we are hearing from some other countries around the world, where the transgender person can take you to court based on this law, or to the ombudsman, or the Human Rights Commission. All of them have certain powers depending on what kind of grievance you are taking, and have that issue resolved within the system under this law. Then not only that, but there are certain obligations on the government itself that they have to establish these protection centers. So, because the law is there, but the society is still far behind. Let's be honest about it, that it'll take a long time for these things to be accepted across the board in the entire society. So, in case there is a case where somebody, some transgender person needs protection, there are safe houses, which the government has to establish in every city, which I know that they have not been. But nevertheless, wherever they are, including medical facilities, including psychological care, counseling, adult education, and so on. That's obligatory on the government to do so. Even in jails, in case they end up in a jail, then separate enclosures for transgender people, rather than to put them in a place where they would be subject to even more danger than they would otherwise. Then sensitization of public servants, particularly the police, as well as the medical care, because those are the two areas where people would end up. So all of those would have to go through training programs to be able to be sensitive to transgender people. Special vocational training for them. Then to start small businesses, because being the most marginalized section of the society, they come, even if they come from say a middle-class family, they end up becoming destitute because even the families sometimes don't take care of you. Then the right to inherit. A transgender person would have the right, depending on whether, because there's a separate, under the Islamic law, a separate kind of inheritance for male and for female. So depending on the choice that you make. And here I always think that they should choose to be male, because male gets a bigger share of the inheritance than a female does. So, but either way, that's up to the person themselves to make a choice, rather than to be just imposed on those persons. Right to education, right to employment, right to vote, right to hold public office. That's protected under this law. You want me to stop? I'm going too far.
No. I would like to ask you, are there public role models who are transgender?
No, not at the level where, for example, we don't have anybody in Parliament who's transgender. I think it's a bit early. There are people who are the leaders in the community as such, who have, in fact, who were partly responsible for getting these kinds of laws passed. But I think with time we will see there are now because having said, I won't go through more of the law. There's a lot more that is in here, and maybe somebody can get a copy of this. But as I said, having passed a law and giving all this protection in the law is one thing, but bringing society up to speed to be able to then getting leadership roles in the society at large, I think there's a lot more that we need to do in order to get to that point.
I heard you say that civil society was very active. in preparation of this kind of legislation, which is actually wonderful because in many countries in the world we don't have these rights for transgender people.
Yes.
So my compliments to Pakistan. So did you, as Member of Parliament, work together with civil society?
Well, a little bit of the background to this is this civil society, the transgender people and their leadership first knocked at the doors of the court, and it was the Supreme Court which bound the government to the very first thing, which is the national identity card. They decreed that the identity card be given to transgender people and given in the same way as they may desire it to be. And everything else then flows from there. Of course, there was also the judgment that there should be legislation. And that was a time when our party, the Pakistan People's Party, picked it up and drafted the law in conjunction with the civil society people who were working with the transgender persons.
Well, thank you so much for this introduction, and probably later on when we have a Q&A, people will ask you some more questions about Pakistan. But now I received word that Valerie Woods would like to talk to us. So let's hear Valerie Woods from Belize, the Speaker of the House. I hope there is some sound.
Espero que puedan poner el sonido porque no se oye.
So this was the easiest part. It's a pre-recorded message. Want to go again?
Yeah. It's a perfect time to meditate and to concentrate.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to join you all today in this important international conference through this statement. My name is Valerie Woods. I'm the Speaker of the House of Representatives of Belize and a member of the Board of Directors of Parliamentarians for Global Action, PGA. My apologies for not being able to be with you in person at this session on the role of legislative reform in promoting protective measures for LGBTI plus persons and decriminalization of consensual same-sex conduct. I join you today virtually in the year and month which marks the 5th anniversary of Belize's landmark human rights case and victory on decriminalization of consensual same-sex. Belize is the first of the CARICOM nations to decriminalize same-sex, and on August 10th, earlier this month, various LGBTI plus groups in Belize celebrated Belize's Pride Day as part of a week of Pride events. The Belize Pride Week has been established each year by the groups since the victory of August 10, 2016. This year, we also had some of our parliamentarians showing their visual support. Let me be clear that it was not the efforts of parliamentarians which was responsible for the legislative victory in 2016. It was the bold, brave initiative of Caleb Orozco in Belize with the support of the University of West Indies Rights Advocacy Project, URA, who took on the legal challenge. The Human Dignity Trust, Commonwealth Lawyers Association, and others joined the effort as well. Today, with an increasing amount of LGBTI plus organizations and people speaking up and stepping out. Today, being 5 years since the case has been won. Today, now that Belize has decriminalized same-sex conduct after years of having signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Today, parliamentarians more than ever need to embrace their role and obligation to ensure that the rights and inclusion of LGBTI plus people are protected and defended. Parliamentarians must fight against discrimination. In my country, Belize, the proposed Equal Opportunities Bill was withdrawn last year in September of 2020 and did not make its way on the legislative agenda of the last Parliament. This was due to strong opposition from the churches. And to put in context as well, the general election was set to be called later that year. In November 2020, a new government was elected and there is a new parliament. Therefore, I am hopeful, I remain optimistic that discussions will resume on an equal opportunities bill and hate crime legislation, going through all its processes and to be discussed fully in Parliament. There's absolutely no denying or downplaying the many challenges to advance LGBTI plus equality and inclusion. The journey may not and it will not be an easy one, but it's a journey nonetheless that parliamentarians are obligated to embark on if the commitments to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and a human rights-based approach in Parliament are to be met. Addressing LGBTI plus human rights is often a neglected issue, but it is in this context engaging parliamentarians is critical. It is crucial to sensitize parliamentarians about the challenges faced by LGBTI plus community and remind them of their obligations under international human rights law in reference to equality and non-discrimination, and their responsibility as elected officials to represent all their constituents, particularly those belonging to vulnerable or marginalized groups. Parliamentarians may be reluctant to defend and promote the rights and inclusion of LGBTI plus people. They may even be reluctant to engage in public conversations about this topic due to their concern of facing criticism from constituents, political opponents, and other stakeholders. This criticism, it is often framed by arguments of religious groups and other conservative, reactionary, and fundamentalist groups. However, parliamentarians are duty-bound to stand up for human rights and for the law over religious arguments. Face-to-face meetings with civil society and LGBTI plus people, listening to their stories and experiences. It's key to helping MPs understand the challenges faced by LGBTI plus people, to empathize with them, and to have the urgency to act. So establishing ongoing communication with civil society organizations that serve LGBTI plus communities, it's critical. And I take the opportunity now to thank the Parliamentarians for Global Action and Human Dignity Trust for co-hosting and coordinating this space today for this very important discussion.
Well, thank you, Valerie Woods. Let's continue. We have another pre-recorded message from Nikki Rattle. She's the former Speaker of the Cook Islands Parliament, which is a parliament in association with New Zealand. So let's listen to Nikki Rattle.
Nikki Rattle, I am the immediate past Speaker of the Cook Islands as of February 2021. I have a very important message to share with you today, and that is in regards to legislation on decriminalizing LGBTQ+. The reason being the Cook Islands legislation actually criminalizes people of same-sex activities. And at the moment, there is a select committee in place to discuss whether to decriminalize or leave the legislation as it is. It is my belief that all people of your country should be treated exactly the same. And it is also my belief, while being the Speaker in Parliament, that the Constitution of the country should not have any legislation made by parliamentarians that contradict the Constitution, which is the case in the Constitution of the Cook Islands in Article 64 of Human Rights. So at the moment, while the legislation is being reviewed by the Select Committee, it is important also that the government also works with civil society. There is an organization, the Cook Islands Family Welfare Association in the Cook Islands that I work with, or in fact as the president. We advocate that LGBTQ+, TIQ+, should be considered the same as everybody in the country as equal human beings and should not be criminalized. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nikki Rattle. We are also joined virtually by two members of parliament from far away. The first one is the Honourable Bernard George, and he's a member of parliament from the Seychelles. I would like to ask Bernard George to tell us a little bit briefly about the state of legislation in terms of protecting LGBTI plus people in the Seychelles. Please go ahead, Bernard.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everyone. It's just into the afternoon here in the Seychelles. Can I first of all thank you for inviting me, and thank you for this wonderful initiative, which is this breakout session within the greater context of what we're talking about here. I speak to you from a country which has a conservative population living within a liberal constitutional and legal framework. So it makes for incredible challenges. There are great positives, but there are also, unfortunately, setbacks, as we all know, with the subject that we are discussing, which is, let's face it, a hot political potato, which members of parliament and governments generally prefer not to hold if they can get away with it, because with an eye on the polls, they sometimes shirk from their duties, or should I say, we sometimes shirk from our duties. We have a wonderful constitutional framework. In fact, our equality provision in the Constitution could not be clearer. Article 27 of our Constitution says that every person has a right to equal protection of the law, etc., 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 without discrimination on any ground. So it doesn't even try to list the grounds, but it just says very clearly on any ground. So we have a wonderful constitutional framework. Unfortunately, as I say, we live in a very conservative society, and we have pushback from especially, let it be said, the religious right, the evangelical churches. However, we live in an extremely tolerant society. I am, since last year, when the party I represent came to government, I have been appointed the leader of the government majority in the House, and I'm very happy to say that out of 25 members in my caucus, 2 are members of the LGBT community, both of them directly elected with very, very good majorities. So you can see that there are inroads being made into the conservativeness, or the general conservativeness of the population. And I think the coup d'envoi, if you wish, was made in 2015 when we, as a result of a perfect legislative storm, where there was no opposition in Parliament, the government managed to push through the repeal of the so-called sodomy laws, which had been a colonial hangout from the middle of the 19th century. So where do we find ourselves today? Well, I think pretty much where most members of Parliament find themselves. We have a duty, as has been said by previous speakers, to speak out, to act, and to take on board an activist role with regard to LGBT rights. Because if we don't do it, governments probably won't. And NGOs, although they are extremely forceful, cannot do it alone. Let me tell you that despite the fact that we had a law on the statute books, that law had not been applied at all for at least 30 years before it was repealed. In fact, I defended, in my capacity as a lawyer, the last person to be prosecuted under the law, and then only because the acts were committed in public. Acts committed in private were never prosecuted. So the step was not very big, but I can tell you the opposition was, and the opposition still remains very vocal, especially from the religious right, against any further inroads into LGBT rights.
Bernard, may I ask you, what is your top priority in terms of legislation that you would like to achieve within the near future for LGBT rights?
Complete equality, and I was just coming to that point, and we might even have done that without realizing it. Late last year, we had a complete revision of the Civil Code, and one of the things that we did was that we conflated marriage and civil unions for property rights only, as a very first minor step. And I'm the one who actually presented the bill to Parliament, and when I did so, I made it very clear that this was the very first of a number of steps. The next one was going to be to extend the civil relationships in general, and the third step was going to include same-gender civil relationships. But here's what we did. Without even realizing it, we defined qualifying relationships as including marriage and civil relationships between persons, without saying civil relationships between a man and a woman. So already, without us realizing it, we've managed to extend the envelope and get complete LGBT rights on board with regard to property. So the next step is complete LGBT rights, not only with regard to property, but with regard to all other legal attributes that follow from such relationships. That's the next priority. And I was telling somebody this morning, I have 4 more years to run in my capacity, and this is number 1 on my agenda, leading my caucus. I'm going to make sure that is done. We have a perfect storm. We're a liberal government that's in power. We have a president who is in favor of such rights and has made it very clear in a CNN interview with Richard Quest that he is. So we see some pushback, but we see a relatively clear field until we are able to achieve.
Well, that sounds very optimistic. Thank you so much, Bernard, and we wish you all the best in achieving all those goals. And if PGA and other members of Parliament can support you, please let us know. But now I would like to go to our next virtual speaker, and that is Fazilet Özdenefe, and she is a Turkish Cypriot Member of Parliament. Welcome to our session, Fazilet, and may I ask you to talk a little bit about the state of legislation in your parliament.
Hello, I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can, loud and clearly.
Greetings to everyone, and thank you for the organizers for this important event. I am Fazilet Özdenefe, member of Legislative Assembly of the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus since 2013, and I'm one of the 3 MPs who introduced changes in the criminal law in 2014. I want to give a brief explanation of how the law is and now in the country. Our criminal law criminalized criminalized same-sex consensual conduct under the offences against morality part of the code. The related clause was titled as unnatural offences and stated that any person who had carnal knowledge of any person against the order of nature, or permits a male person to have carnal knowledge of him against the order of nature, was guilty of a felony, and that was liable for imprisonment for up to 5 years. It is important to note that our criminal code, which is a colonial code, had very minimal changes since it was last put together in 1959, and the offences against morality part had no major changes except for a clause which was brought in 1989 with regard to some important exceptions that were introduced about the general criminalization of abortion. And also under this section, the offences against morality, we had a clause explaining rape and punishing rape, but it only stated that rape included unlawful carnal knowledge of a female person. And for example, defilement of girls between the ages of 13 and 16 had a defense if the girl looked above the age of 16. And there were different clauses for indecent assault against males and females. So overall, we believe that this part of the criminal code needed some major changes with the aim of protecting the individual and not the morality of the society. And at the time, there were voices in the society stating that, like my colleague mentioned just now, we are not using this clause, so why make it an issue? But it was important that we explained to everyone involved that the fact that it's not being used, which is not exactly true actually, it was being used, but not very common, that is true, that the fact that it was there was against human rights. And also another argument we had from certain parts of the society that was the only clause protecting younger boys, and if that was repealed, then we would have lost to the protection the law gave to basically young boys being raped or being used because of their age. Some of them were underage in the sexual relations, basically. So as a result, decriminalization, consensual same-sex conduct and repealing the related articles in the criminal code was conducted within a broader framework on criminal code that included all sexual offences, also taking into account the concerns of people that repealing these articles only would leave some offences unpunished. This reform package that we passed in 2014 included changing the name of the offences against morality part to sexual offences. Terms of consent and sexual conduct were redefined in a gender-sensitive manner. Burden of proof was shifted in certain situations. Rape, sexual assault, sexual harassment was redefined. And we introduced heavier penalties for certain listed motivations and circumstances that included hate or prejudice on the basis of the victim's sexual orientation or gender identity. It is also important to note that this process was further accelerated by a case brought to the European Court of Human Rights against Turkey, as well as a European MEP, Mr. Cashman, visiting Northern Cyprus, and all these happened between 2011 and 2014. For those of you who may not be aware, TRNC or Northern Cyprus is only recognized by Turkey, and human rights violations in the northern part of the island are all brought against Turkey based on the international legal acknowledgement that Turkey is the responsible authority. This broad approach that we brought in 2014 also ensured human rights, women's and feminist movements, women rights groups and feminist groups to support the whole reform package. I think that was important. Furthermore, while articles criminalizing male homosexuality was repealed, instead, articles that criminalized economical and psychological violence motivated by hate or prejudice, and discrimination by a civil servant or an employee providing public service against someone benefiting from public service on the basis of victims' sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity were also introduced. This further emphasized the political standpoint mind of the legislator when it came to treatment of LGBTI plus in the society. This in turn had an important effect on the attitudes of the administration and the police, not only towards homosexual men individually, but also towards it's also important to note that this is a continuing process. The important changes are there, we made them, but we still have to continue to liaise with the civil society.
Thank you so much, Fazilet. I'm going to interrupt here.
With the civil society,
I hope you can hear me.
Should be continued. In our experience,
Fazilet, can you hear me?
Criminalizing libel based on gender, sexual orientation, or identity. You can shortly put it as hate.
Thank you so much, Fazilet.
That we passed in 2014. In time, proved not.
We'll continue now with our panel discussion.
Received by the Human Rights and LGBTI organization. Thus, in 2020.
Fazilet, can you hear me?
Unfortunately,
I don't think so.
I can't.
But I'm looking at the clock as well, and unfortunately, we don't have so much time, and we have a very distinguished guest sitting next to me here. It's a member of Parliament, Jorge Calix. And Jorge Calix is a member of Parliament in Honduras, a country which is in the news, of course, because of all kind of difficulties. So it's wonderful that you're here, that you could take the time to be with us. May I ask you, and I know that you will answer me in Spanish, but could you talk to us a little bit about the state of legislation to protect LGBT people in your country?
Of course, great. Thank you, Boris. As you said, I'll ask in Spanish, or I'll ask you please to use your device. Bueno, hemos trabajado nosotros, Boris, con algunas organizaciones de la comunidad LGTBI más en Honduras para hacer algunas reformas a la legislación hondureña en dos vías. La primera, haciendo cambios sumamente pequeños, pero que pueden generar un significado importante en nuestra legislación. En Honduras, lo explico a continuación brevemente, en Honduras la comunidad LGTBI tiene prohibido contraer matrimonio, no pueden heredar si su pareja muere y tampoco pueden hacer ninguna denuncia de violencia doméstica en caso de que sufran de este tipo de violencia. ¿Por qué? Porque la Constitución dice que un hombre puede contraer matrimonio con una mujer. La legislación, la ley de violencia doméstica establece que una mujer puede denunciar a un hombre. Entonces, las comunidades LGTBI más en Honduras nos decían, solo cambiemos la redacción. Y en vez de decir que un hombre puede casarse con una mujer, digamos que en Honduras una persona puede contraer matrimonio con otra, sin especificar el sexo, y eso les abría a ellos la ventana para poder tener este derecho. Con el tema de violencia doméstica nos decían exactamente lo mismo. En vez de decir que una mujer puede denunciar a un hombre por violencia doméstica o viceversa, que diga que la pareja que sufra de violencia doméstica puede denunciar. Quien sufra de violencia doméstica, puede denunciar a su pareja sin especificar el sexo. Esto lo presentamos hace 3 años en el Congreso Nacional y todavía no hemos logrado que se apruebe. Hay una razón, el Congreso está controlado por el Partido Conservador. En consecuencia, es un poco difícil que esto pase. Sin embargo, nuestra labor como diputado, como creyente y defensor de los derechos humanos y además como miembro de PGA es poder impulsar esto hasta que lo logremos. Estoy seguro que estamos cerca de lograrlo, o al menos lo vamos a hacer en el futuro inmediato. También hemos trabajado últimamente con una organización llamada Somos CDC, que es el Centro para el Desarrollo y la Cooperación LGTBI+ en Honduras, quienes han trabajado un proyecto de ley de igualdad y equidad. Con la mediación de PGA y de su secretariado, hemos sostenido reuniones con los miembros de PGA en Honduras para poder socializar el proyecto de ley. Este proyecto de ley fue elaborado a través de un amplio proceso de consultas con organizaciones de sociedad civil. No solo tiene que ver con la igualdad y los derechos de las personas LGTBI+, sino que de otros grupos vulnerables en Honduras también, como mujeres, afrodescendientes, negros, niños, niñas, etc. Es bastante integral. Y bueno, el proyecto está en este momento en la Secretaría de Derechos Humanos, que participaron en su elaboración, en la elaboración del proyecto. Lo remitieron al Congreso. No ha continuado el trámite. Hemos decidido en consenso con esta organización Somos CDC no impulsarlo por ahora porque el 28 de noviembre hay elecciones generales en mi país y queremos evitar que la ley sea objeto de campaña de todo tipo. Así que el acuerdo al que hemos llegado los miembros de PGA, que tuvimos una reunión en junio, si mal no recuerdo, con esta organización, y también con la mediación, como lo dije anteriormente, del secretariado de PGA, acordamos que en febrero del otro año, una vez que asuma el nuevo gobierno, se iba a introducir el proyecto y ahí sí íbamos a echar con todo para poder lograr que se apruebe, para no contaminarlo en medio de la campaña electoral. Este proyecto de ley, lo resumo muy brevemente, toca los siguientes puntos: para proteger la discriminación, como lo dije anteriormente, a grupos en situación de vulnerabilidad, personas LGTBI+, mujeres, niñez y adolescencia, adultos mayores, grupos étnicos, personas afro-hondureñas y negros, personas con discapacidad, migrantes, defensores de derechos humanos y personas privadas de libertad. Así que este proyecto de ley, que esperamos sea ley, y la próxima vez que podamos vernos les pueda contar que es ley en la República de Honduras, contiene protección para estos grupos, contempla prevención temprana, sanciones pedagógicas y, en último caso, sanciones criminales para quienes practiquen discriminación para todos estos grupos. Como lo dije anteriormente, en la reunión que tuvimos en junio, los miembros de PGA con la organización Somos CDC acordamos posponer la discusión del proyecto de ley para el otro año, pero en el marco de la campaña socializar este proyecto de ley con los candidatos presidenciales de todos los partidos políticos para que puedan conocerlo y generar compromisos con los grupos vulnerables que, como lo dije, pues no uno solo, son varios en mi país.
Could you tell us, Jorge, how did PGA help you, support you in drafting the bill and, thinking about how the legislation should look like?
Bueno, de muchas formas. La primera, organizando reuniones con esta organización de sociedad civil que aglutina otras que trabajan con la comunidad LGTBI en Honduras. PGA trabaja directamente con ellos y ha sido el puente que comunica a la sociedad civil con los parlamentarios miembros de PGA en Honduras. De manera que la colaboración y el aporte que PGA le está dando al país con este tema es importantísimo, porque está poniendo a trabajar a la sociedad civil y a los partidos políticos representados en el Congreso por miembros de PGA, que son de todas las bancadas, dicho sea de paso, trabajar unidos para poder lograr que este proyecto de ley salga adelante. Así que no solo es en la asesoría técnica material de la construcción del proyecto de ley en sí, sino que también en poder conjuntar esfuerzos para que podamos entre todos salir adelante.
My last question to you is there a lot of religious opposition against the proposal?
Sí.
And how do you counter that?
Es complicado. Bueno, sí. Honduras es un país muy pobre y mientras más pobre, más religiones hay, ¿verdad? O más control religioso existe. Es directamente proporcional, lastimosamente. Generalmente hablamos de la Iglesia Católica y la importancia que tiene en los grupos económicos y de poder, pero en Honduras hay otro actor relevante en este tema, que es la Iglesia Evangélica, la Iglesia Protestante, que es más conservadora que la Iglesia Católica. Nuestra Constitución dice que somos un Estado laico. Sin embargo, se le han dado funciones a pastores dentro del Estado, en comisiones técnicas, en comisiones de observación, remuneradas, por supuesto. Tienen cargos dentro del Estado y tienen una injerencia tremenda al grado que han logrado, por ejemplo, promover que la Embajada de Honduras en Israel se mueva de Tel Aviv a Jerusalén. Solo hay 2 países en el mundo que tienen su embajada en Jerusalén. Uno es Honduras, por la fuerza que tiene la comunidad religiosa protestante, ni siquiera judía, dentro del país. Entonces es fuerte, no es fácil. Pero bueno, es un reto. Los legisladores hay 2 tipos de legisladores en el mundo: los que defienden los derechos humanos y los que no defienden los derechos humanos. Y los derechos humanos son para todos. En ese caso, a nosotros nos toca luchar y nadar contra la corriente, pero lo vamos a lograr eventualmente.
Yes, thank you so much, Jorge. I'm a little bit mindful of the clock. I didn't do my job well. We only have 5 minutes left, but I'm sure that there is somebody who would like to ask a question. Please, a very short question. Speak up. I will repeat the question for the people. Okay.
Hi, my name is Felix Solstol. I'm the president
La pregunta sin micrófono. Lamentablemente no oímos la pregunta si no hay micrófono.
Party family in Europe. First of all, Senator Decriminalization, thank you for your historic contribution to the LGBT movement. I'm married thanks to you. My question is, in your mind, what would be the single most important key factor in actually achieving decriminalization across the world?
Across the world. Well, this is really a good question for the 4 minutes we have left. Does somebody would like to answer the question? Because it's of course very, very complicated. And what I can say in my role as a moderator is that each country is different. So there is not one single answer that fits all the countries in the world. But as we know, and one of the speakers said so, that it's a colonial legislation in many countries in the world. Well, every year at the Commonwealth of Nations, people get together, politicians get together, and that would be a wonderful forum, and it has been a forum in the past. Theresa May, for instance, gave a speech a few years ago that she called upon all countries, former colonies, to decriminalize. And we are talking about 29 countries, former colonies of the United Kingdom. Unfortunately, it hasn't happened yet, but this is a forum where members of parliament, but also LGBT activists could really get together and push those governments who will attend those conferences to step forward and decriminalize. Is there another question? Yes, please.
Otra pregunta.
Les interprètes s'excusent, mais nous n'entendons pas les questions posées dans la salle.
I will repeat your question if it's brief.
HIV and also criminalization of reproductive rights parallel to LGBTQIA rights.
Yes. There's a question from the audience. I didn't get your name. So.
From New York City.
Okay. Tom Duane from New York State, United States, and he asks if there is a parallel between criminalization of HIV and criminalization of LGBT conduct and reproductive rights. Is there somebody who would like to answer that question? No, it's not an answer. It's another question. Maybe, Naveed, do you have a beginning of an answer?
No, actually, obviously coming from a country where HIV is not criminalized. It's treated as something that has its own medical consequences and has to be treated as any other disease would be. And for that matter, when you say reproductive rights, I'm presuming laws on abortion and so on. Again, it is not criminalized or it's not prohibited. So in that sense, I think perhaps where it is a criminal offense, maybe somebody can answer.
Here is Alexander Hemmelberg, who used to be a member of the Dutch LGBT organization COC, but now elected member of parliament, and he has the answer to all our questions. Alexander, maybe you can go to the microphone.
Yeah, this is working. In many contexts, specifically in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in other geographies in the world, what you see is sometimes ministries of healthcare are actually accessible to combat HIV and AIDS and are willing to conduct more inclusive healthcare, even sometimes if it's under the radar. And this could be a stepping stone in the future towards decriminalization. And this is also a reason that many African activists, gay and LGBTI activists generally say, please, countries like the Netherlands, where I am from, be careful with asking immediately for decriminalization of same-sex conduct, where this might actually lead to a lashback, and start working on healthcare and inclusiveness in healthcare under the radar, together with your Ministry of Healthcare and our Ministry of Healthcare. This, in many contexts, is the best way. And I think the general remark that was also posed by question towards Boris, if you want to know the local context, there's only one way to find out for us as parliamentarians, and that is to get in touch, as Vivian Woods also said, with the civil society organizations that know best what the priorities in that context will be. So I think that will be the first step that we as parliamentarians could take.
Okay, thank you. Please go to the microphone. This is our colleague from the Dominican Republic.
Gracias. En la República Dominicana tenemos una ley sobre SIDA. Pero esa ley garantiza el derecho de la persona afectada de VIH. Pero existe discriminación a estos ciudadanos a la hora cuando van a buscar trabajo o cuando van a un reconocimiento, a una actividad, incluso para ir a la universidad. Es decir, estamos en un tema de inclusión. Y el tema de inclusión no es solamente para el VIH, sino también para la comunidad LGTB, para los trabajadores, para los negros, para los trabajadores, para la pobreza. La inclusión es un concepto general. Por eso estoy de acuerdo, como decía el compañero de Honduras, es un tema de derechos humanos. Y los derechos humanos no tienen término medio, son derechos humanos. Y hay que defenderlo para la comunidad LGTBIQ+, para lo de VIH, para los migrantes, para los pobres, para los trabajadores, porque en definitiva, cuando no se tiene esa inclusión en la totalidad, entonces aparece la discriminación. Y al final lo que procuramos es la igualdad y la justicia, que es para todos. Algunos podemos tener condiciones, pero no hay discriminación cuando no se cumple con esos derechos. Y es decir que la comunidad VIH, también como la LGTB, sufren discriminación, aún con leyes en la República Dominicana. Gracias.
Thank you so much. Yes, please go to the microphone. Here is our colleague from El Salvador.
Buenos días a todas y a todos. Sumamente breve, decir que coincido muchísimo con el parlamentario de Honduras. Yo estuve durante 6 años como diputado de la Asamblea Legislativa, recién voy terminando mi mandato, pero fui quien impulsó el primer proyecto de ley de educación sexual y reproductiva en el país y también la primera ley antidiscriminación. Algo que es importante decirlo, muchas veces pasa que los sectores conservadores trabajan de una forma conjunta. junta. Los pentecostales, los católicos, los evangélicos, todos los grupos fundamentalistas se unen con un frente común cuando se trata de derechos de las mujeres o derechos de la población LGBT. Algo que a mí me funcionó muchísimo y lo comparto como una experiencia con el legislador de Honduras es unir al bloque progresista, los defensores del medio ambiente, los defensores de los derechos de las mujeres, la población LGBT. Entonces, lamentablemente, en el país no se lograron aprobar ambos proyectos de ley. Sin embargo, fue un primer paso para poder trabajar, ya que hace 6 años, cuando yo entré a la Asamblea Legislativa, era casi que pecado o era prohibido hablar de esos temas. Y luego construimos 2 proyectos de leyes y también creamos un grupo parlamentario de jóvenes, del cual fui presidente, y logramos poner en el centro esta agenda. Entonces, creo que también es importante que en la región centroamericana, que las realidades son bastante comunes, poder ocupar organismos como el Parlamento Centroamericano o algún tipo de mecanismo, el SICA, para poder unirnos y hacer que esos temas avancen.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful. Please state your name. And
thank you very much. Hans-Peter Portman. I'm from the Swiss Parliament, and I want to bring in a little bit another view also, or one more view. We have heard a lot of Latin American countries and other countries. For me, we are much more steps in front of it, but for me, legislation is not enough anymore. I don't want to have rights and respects on paper. I want to have it in the hearts of my neighbors, of my citizenships. I want to be respected from them, and I want that they do not have any more resistance against my life. And Switzerland will be and is the first country who is voting this in the public now, the marriage. I know we are behind of it. We are also a conservative country with the direct democracy. In September, we will vote, and it's the first country in the world where the people can vote about LGBTQI right. The latest poll got out today, and it's 67% pro, but it's still 1/3 contra. 1/3 in my liberal country of people think we should not have the same right. And I encourage all of you countries, go your way, but it's not enough to change your laws. You have to change the people and their hearts, and you have to change their opinions about our rights.
Thank you so much. I remember in the Republic of Ireland, when there was a referendum on same-sex marriage, there was also 63% in favor. So Ireland was the first country with a referendum. But now, when you look at the numbers, it has raised because people are used to the fact that people who love each other can get married. Now, our last speaker will be David, the Director of Parliamentarians for Global Action.
Thank you, Boris. And you refer to the Commonwealth, and many references have been made to other situations of decriminalization. Let me bring on the table a little bit of a more technical aspect, but I think it's important also for lawmakers to empower with these tools. Well, in my humble view, there is no criminal offense without a victim. So in the process of modernization of criminal codes, and this is the experience, for example, of Portuguese-speaking country, Angola and Mozambique, which are the only 2 sub-Saharan African countries that decriminalized, in addition to Seychelles, which is an island state. They did so quietly, but with the purpose of eliminating from the criminal code all type of forms of offenses that had no victims, no victimization. So sedition, for example, was eliminated, or protesting against an order of a police officer, or burning the flag. It can be still punished with an administrative sanction. And in this process of modernization, they struck out this criminalization of homosexuality, which also they inherited from Portuguese legislation. So I think this will be maybe more technical, less political, but can go hand in hand, and this is a technique that PGA has been using in a number of countries, where without maybe making a big debate around it, but that's, as our colleague from Switzerland, is very, very important to then win the hearts and minds of the population. But the first step may be also through a modernization process to strike out all these old offenses that sometimes burden the criminal justice sector.
Well, thank you so much for these last words. I would like to conclude our session because it's over 12 and we need to go to lunch. One of the objectives was to get together and to collaborate together and to inspire each other. We can do so over lunch. You can all become members of Parliamentarians for Global Action if you choose so, and that would be a wonderful way to stay connected and to share those best practices, because we can learn so much from each other, because we all go through the same kind of types of difficulties as members of Parliament, and there is a wealth of experience that we can tap into. So thank you so much for being here, and we'll see you during the course of the day. Thank you so much.